We'll call the meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 5 of the House of Commons Special Committee on the Canada People's Republic of China relationship. Pursuant to Order of Reference May 16, 2022, the committee is meeting on its study of the Canada People's Republic of China relations. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format, pursuant to the House Order of June 23, 2022. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. I would also note that everybody appearing by Zoom, especially our witnesses, have had their sound checks done, so everybody should be able to hear everybody quite properly. If you are one of our witnesses, make sure that your microphone is sort of spaced between your nose and your upper lip, and that way the interpreters will be able to hear. Mr. Hamilton, that's perfect. Thank you. So a few comments for the benefit of the witnesses and members. Please wait till I recognize you by name before speaking. If you're participating by video conference, of course, you click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you're not speaking. Interpretation for those on Zoom, you have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. And for those in the room, you can use the earpiece with the selected channel. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. The chair of another committee that I sit on also reminds people that you cannot take pictures of your screens while the session is underway. For members in the room, of course, we have the speaking order, at least most of it, and I will look to Mr. Chong to fill me in as to who his lineup is going to be, because we don't have it yet. Tom, oh good, yeah, pick on the guy that's not there. All right, that's good, okay. We'll manage the speaking order as best we can, particularly because we will be into committee business in the third hour. So now I'd like to welcome our witnesses for the first hour. Clive Hamilton is Professor of Public Ethics at Charles Sturt University, Canberra campus. Jeremy Yude is Dean of the College of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences, University of Minnesota, Duluth. We have yet to connect with our third person in the first panel, and that's Jonathan Manthorpe, former foreign correspondent, China watcher, and author of Claws of the Panda. And yes, here's the list. Very good. All right. So with that, we'll have our witnesses present up to 5 minutes for an opening statement. Mr. Hamilton, we will start with you, and your 5 minutes starts now.
Thank you, Chair. It's a pleasure to appear before the committee this evening. I'd like to make some...
One second, hold on. We have, that audio is not good at all.
Sound was tested a few minutes ago, but I guess we'll have to check.
Do you want to just count to 10 for us, please, Mr. Hamilton?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Oh, yes. I think what we're going to have you do is sign off and sign back in.
I would suggest maybe you go to the second.
Yes.
Witness
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we'll fix that.
So we'll try and get you more properly attached here, Mr. Hamilton. With that, then, Mr. Yude, we'll go to you for 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you so much for the invitation, and I hope my sound is coming through okay for everyone. Perfect. I come to you today to speak as the Dean of the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences at the University of Minnesota, Duluth. I'm also a political scientist who is particularly interested in questions of global health governance and international responses to infectious disease outbreaks. So when we're thinking about global health governance, we're thinking about the system for responding to cross-border health issues that arise. And that is an issue in which Canada has long been a leader, and the People's Republic of China has a very important potential role to play, but is a role that has been called into question in recent years. And in many ways, we are in a paradoxical moment when it comes to global health governance. On the one hand, we have seen, particularly over these past few years, we have seen more than ever the importance of having a cooperative arrangement that brings together countries across the globe in order to address issues and concerns that necessarily cross borders. No country is going to be able to deal with an issue like COVID-19 on its own. Yet at the same time, we are also seeing a moment in which there is more resistance than ever to engaging in these sorts of processes. And again, many of these sorts of challenges that have come up in the context of the relationship between the global health governance system and the government of the People's Republic of China. And in many ways, the People's Republic of China is a vital element of any effective system of global health governance for a number of different reasons. One is obviously an incredibly significant geopolitical player. Any sort of international system that isn't including China is going to have major gaps in it. Second, the sheer number of people and the movement of those people mean that there are particular challenges that come up when we're talking about the control of infectious diseases and their spread, be they new diseases or diseases that we've previously seen. Third, the degree of human-animal interactions that can exist within Chinese society, particularly as we see more and more people moving into areas where there has not been sustained human residence, causes a great challenge. We know that zoonotic diseases that spread from animals to human, are one of the most important causes of new disease outbreaks. And then finally, China also has a history of what we could call health diplomacy, engaging in health activities as a way of trying to build bilateral and multilateral relations with other countries. Yet the system that we've seen over these past few years has really called the ability of the system to function in a cohesive manner into question. And as I mentioned before, COVID-19 is perhaps emblematic of that. And we have a system, when we're looking at global health governance, we have a system that's largely based on notions of trust and shared norms of how the things are going to operate. And this is where we have run into problems, particularly in these last few years when it comes to COVID-19. And we can talk in the questions in some more detail about this, but the resistance comes from a number of different areas, including fears about surveillance that could come into play, the relationship between Taiwan and other elements of global governance, and just the general wariness that we've seen within the government of the People's Republic of China to engage with global governance systems in general, not just in health. The system was largely built in the aftermath of World War II, and it is not necessarily the most reflective of the sorts of challenges and needs that the contemporary international system demands. And so in many ways, this is a moment of reform and opportunity for global health governance. But as I mentioned before, if there is not the inclusion of the People's Republic of China in this sort of process, we're going to have significant gaps, and those gaps are going to put us in danger. And Canada, as a country that has long been a leader in global health governance and the sort of multilateral diplomacy, is in a very important and unique position to be able to help foster this new sort of system that can include the People's Republic of China, the United States, and all the countries around the world.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yude. Now, I just would, for safety's sake, like Mr. Hamilton to try speaking to us and see if I see the kind of unit you're using. If you can hold that microphone fairly close to your mouth so that the interpreters can hear what you're saying. Do you want to try? No, it's even worse. All right. Well, we'll have to stretch the line a little tighter, I guess. I'm going to then go to somebody I'm looking forward to hearing from. In fact, Jonathan Manthorpe, who I used to listen to on the radio in Vancouver a lot when he was on with John McComb talking about Asia and especially China, and his story hasn't really changed very much because he's had a tremendous depth of experience in following that nation. So, Mr. Manthorpe, welcome to our committee. You have 5 minutes to make an opening statement.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for inviting me to give my thoughts and answers to your questions on what is, I think, one of the most important foreign policy issues for Canada at this moment. As you may know, my book, Claws of the Panda, Beijing's Campaign of Influence and Intimidation in Canada, was published within a few days of the start of the Huawei affair. I had conflicting reactions to the detention in Vancouver on December 2nd, 2018, on a United States Department of Justice request of Meng Wanzhou, the Chief Financial Officer of Huawei Technologies, and all that happened in the following months. On one hand, I felt some satisfaction that those events substantiated much of what I had written in the book. On the other hand, I was alarmed that those events substantiated much of what I had written in the book. Indeed, I thought then, and I still do, that the Huawei affair set out a much worse situation than I had described of the catalogue of intrusions into Canadian affairs by the Chinese Communist Party and the insouciant response of Canadian decision makers. And the response from Beijing to the detention of Ms. Meng was far more brutal than even I anticipated. The kidnapping and torture of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor sent a clear message in itself that the CCP cares more about the security of one party aristocrat than it does about the entire spectrum of relations with Canada. More than that, the denial of legitimate consular access to the two Michaels and their secret trials said that Beijing is prepared to ignore treaties it has signed in order to defend the honor of any high-profile official. The CCP regime followed up its hostage-taking with economic sanctions on Canadian meat and grain products, and whether by coincidence or not, several senior Canadian figures with histories of close ties with Beijing began to advocate for her release. At the same time, Beijing continued its ever-increasing campaign to cow the 1.5 million Canadians of ethnic Chinese heritage. Several carefully documented reports have been published on how agents of Beijing, either from the Ministry of State Security or the CCP's main political warfare organization, the United Front Work Department, are intimidating and threatening Canadians who the party considers a threat. The United Front has also taken effective control of almost all Chinese language media in Canada. And it has in all, as it has in all other countries, in the 50 million strong ethnic Chinese diaspora. And the United Front has worked to place Beijing supporters in the leadership of the multitude of Canadian Chinese social groups and organizations. It has been notable how many of those groups have published support for crushing of the promised autonomy of Hong Kong, the abuses against the Uyghurs and Kazakhs in Xinjiang, and other Beijing projects such as the planned takeover of Taiwan. A year ago, the Huawei affair came to an end when Ms. Meng admitted to the US charges against her that she had made fraudulent claims to international banks, and the extradition request was dropped. She was released, and so were the two Michaels. But to my mind, the lessons of this affair are stark. My central conclusion is that we cannot have normal trade, diplomatic, or political relations with a regime whose first instinct when there are problems is to take hostages. What this affair exposed and underlined is that we share no civic, political, diplomatic, security, or international values with the People's Republic of China. On most matters involved in the relationship between two nations, we have no basis for conversation with the Chinese Communist Party. Imagine for a moment that the US request had been for the detention of a business executive from one of the neighboring Asian democracies such as Japan, South Korea, or Taiwan. There would have been frictions to be sure, but there would not have been a total crisis and collapse in the relationship because we share a host of values with those countries, and that would have cushioned the momentary clash. Now, I have no doubt that we must reconstruct a working relationship with Beijing. The PRC is now the second largest economy in the world, though it is facing headwinds at the moment. And under leader Xi Jinping, it seems bent on an imperialist course towards becoming a global superpower, if not the superpower. But my judgment is that we should keep that to a minimalist transactional relationship. The current regime in Beijing has shown us clearly that it is not a friend of China and never intends to be. We should not waste our time trying to reform the CCP, as we have done in the past, with several expensive and futile projects, such as teaching the rule of law and jointly chairing a traveling human rights roadshow. These were doomed to fail because Beijing has no intention of accepting their conclusions.
Mr.
Instead,
Manthorpe, I will have to call it for time there, but
Okay.
if you have further information, of course, you can work it into your answers as we go to the panel.
Okay.
Thank you very
Let
much.
me just, okay.
Oh, do you have something?
I just want to finish off by saying that I think our most important program at the moment should be to defend Canadians of Chinese, Uyghur, and Tibetan heritage from the attacks on them by the United Front and the Ministry of State Security in Canada. And I will leave it at that, and I'll answer questions happily later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, Mr. Hamilton, let's give it a try for 5 minutes or less, sir.
Well, let me ask Chair, can you hear me reasonably well now?
No, not at all. It's still very poor.
Wonderful.
I'm thinking that perhaps what we may need to do, sir, is if there are questions directed at you or to you, that you might be able to respond in writing. That's the best we can do under the circumstances.
Solve the problem. I'm not an expert, but I didn't see him log off and reconnect again. So maybe you can try that.
Sure. Will do.
I think maybe what we might try and do is get Mr. Hamilton back here in our second hour, because we'll have a space there, and hopefully we'll be able to get the benefit of his experience. Being in Australia, of course, they've had their moments with China for sure. So with that, then perhaps we can just go to our first round of questioning, and we'll start with Mr. Kamek for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you, Chair. So my first question will be to Mr. Manthorpe. I'm glad he was able to finish, and I have read Claws of the Panda. So I wanted, if Chair, if he could continue speaking about the United Front Department's activities, intimidating Canadians of Chinese heritage and activists as well, because he had written back in July 2020 in National Post, as someone who has studied the influence of China in Canada, it is clear to me that this country needs to put in place defenses against the covert, coercive, and corrupt influences of the CCP, which has been systematically eroding resistance to it from within. So my question, Chair, would be, where do we start? How can we protect Canadians of Chinese heritage who are being targeted by these coercive campaigns?
Thank you very much, sir. Yeah, I think our security services and our police services know very well what is going on. There needs to be some political encouragement for them to deal with what they know. As we already know, the CSIS has gone around Canadian universities and colleges and has warned them that the Confucius Institutes that many had installed in their universities, paid for by Beijing, CSIS warned them that these were nothing much more than espionage outposts in their universities, but with two main functions. One was to oversee Chinese students in the universities, and the other was to scout the universities for useful technologies, principally military technologies. Thankfully, most Canadian universities and colleges have ended their agreements with the Confucius Institutes, which are run, by the way, by the United Front, by the political warfare organization. I think that an overarching thing we need to do is to have a strong piece of legislation regulating and allowing for severe punishments or retribution for political activity in Canada by foreign countries. I think we do have some sort of legislation at the moment, but it clearly is not tough enough. And it needs also to be applied. Several other countries Australia being one of them. And I hope we can hear from Clive later on, because about their experience with their application of this legislation about regulating and curtailing activities of foreign political
Mr. Manthorpe,
organizations.
sorry to interrupt you, Chair. So just as a follow-up, so today we had a motion that we voted on, a concurrence report condemning again the genocide of the Uyghurs. I've never seen cabinet ministers flee so quickly from the chamber in order to avoid having to have a say on this question. But there are many Uyghur activists in Canada, Canadians who through good faith are human rights defenders. And we have a government here which is unwilling to take a very clear position because I guess they're worried. And what should be done about public office holders in Canada and former public office holders especially, which in experience in Australia have been, either coerced or convinced over time that the position that Beijing takes on things like democracy activists outside of the PRC should be, shut down, should be prevented from speaking up, or should be coerced through, these other means. What should we do about former public office holders in Canada who may be towing the line of Beijing?
Well, I think all we can do is shame them. There are, as you say, many previous public office holders who have found in retirement comfortable positions and arrangements with Beijing. I think that it's forums such as this and others need to make it plain to everyone that China, or the People's Republic of China, is not a friend of Canada, and that people who court relationships with Beijing for one reason or another are in fact working against the interests of Canada. I'm not sure. I've talked with other people in other countries about this, and it is very difficult in defending a democracy to immediately put on one side the central aspects of democracy regarding freedom of speech and freedom of association. You can't do that very easily, which is why I think that perhaps the main thrust has to be a legislation dealing with foreign
Mr. Manthorpe, just to interrupt you because I'm running out of time, the chair is telling me. So would legislation that applies to former public office holders that would increase transparency in their financial relationships with state-owned companies in the PRC be a good idea?
Well, and not only with the PRC, I think that there ought to be some regulations over former office holders for a period of years anyway. I mean, I think that makes sense from any number of perspectives.
Thank you, sir. We'll now go to Ms. Yip for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you to the witnesses for coming out this evening or joining us virtually. My first questions are to Mr. Manthorpe. What is your takeaway in the 20th National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party's meeting that just happened recently?
I think the immediate takeaway, I think, is probably fairly commonly held, and that is that Xi Jinping now has a very firm grip on the Communist Party and on the regime in Beijing. He has surrounded himself with his supporters and his cronies. I think he is, one of the important things to notice is that he has buried this meritocracy that had grown up in the last 20, 30 years and has made the regime now simply a coterie of people who are his supporters. So I think it's quite a dangerous time. I really do. It's going to take a while before we see the full implications. But I think, for example, he is not going to be too concerned about the economic well-being of China. He's going to be more concerned about maintaining his authoritarian control. As we speak, there are about 400 million Chinese people under lockdowns. That's a third of the population. and his authoritarian state is the most technologically sophisticated thing the world has ever seen. So I think it is a very troubling and dangerous time, and I think he is a person to be looked at with much caution.
Hu Jintao being led away, was it a message?
I don't know. My links with China watchers have come up with all kinds of conspiracy theories, and I have no idea. I'm not sure in the end that it's that important. It could have been a signal that the times have changed, but equally it could have been that Hu Jintao was having a seniors moment and he was just helped off. I have no idea. I don't think in the big scheme of things it's that important, quite honestly.
How should Canada interpret the events of that particular meeting?
Well, I think what we have to recognize, as I said at the very beginning of my notes at the start, that we are entering a very critical period in world history where the position of China in the world is going to be of huge importance to our foreign policy. And what I didn't have room or time to say in my notes is that we really need to focus our attention on building strong relationships with like-minded countries in Asia. We need to set on one side our now 30, 40, 50-year-old efforts to try to be friends with the Chinese Communist Party and recognize that our future in Asia is with fellow democracies or countries that are becoming democracies.
Opening statement, you indicated that there should not be any trade with China, yet you also recognize the fact that China is our second largest trading partner. Could you elaborate on your answer of minimalist transactions?
Yeah, no, I don't think that we we have to trade with China. No, I'm sorry if what I said was not clear. No, we do, but I think that we shouldn't get we shouldn't get too ambitious about it, and we shouldn't think that it can go too far. I mean, if you look at the nature of trade now, what we are selling China is what we were selling China in 1960. We're selling a bit more of it now, but we're still, all those fanciful thoughts there were in 1970 and afterwards that we might have, Canadian businesses in China simply has not come to pass. I was traveling in China and talking to Canadians a great deal in the 1990s, and they all had very similar experiences. If they set up, their technology was stolen immediately, and they went out of business because a rival company would set up down the road doing what they did much more cheaply. I think there are hardly any Canadian businesses operating in China now, and they're certainly under Xi Jinping, who is down on private enterprise anyway. There are not going to be Canadian companies operating in China.
Thank you for your answer. Okay, I'm moving on to Mr. Yord. You wrote an article this year about COVID in China, and I'd like to quickly quote from it. The divergent experiences do lead to questions about why certain governments are more willing to increase restrictions in order to lower the number of COVID-19 cases. While there may be a tendency to ascribe the differences to cultural explanations, broader domestic and international political explanations need to be explored. Could you provide more background as to what domestic and international political explanations need to be explored?
We'll need a fairly brief answer. Ms. Yip's time has expired, but we should hear what you have to say, Mr. Yu.
Sure. Thank you. I'll be brief. I think there is a need to look at the domestic politics, the fact that we just had this big national party Congress, that plays into it. We've seen that historically if we look at the response that China had to SARS, for instance. And on the geopolitical front, we also have to look at the relationships that existed between, say, China and the United States and the way that became politicized, and how that had an influence on the sorts of relationships and the willingness to engage with international standards and international recommendations about the movements of goods and people during the pandemic.
Thank you for that, sir. I will now go to Monsieur Bergeron for 6 minutes.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
J'étais à l'autre micro.
I was on the other mic. Thank you, Mr. Chair. My first question is for Mr. Manthorpe. Through the media, you heard about the report from Safeguard Defenders, according to which there would be 3, in a way, police stations in the Greater Toronto Area that would be serving the interests of the People's Republic of China. First off, how do you respond to this information? And how do you think Canada should respond to this, to the establishment of these sort of police stations, insofar as that may actually be the case?
Mr. Manthorpe, have you had trouble with the translation?
Yes, I have, I'm afraid. I didn't get the translation at all.
Okay.
I thought I turned it on, but I obviously haven't.
I'll tell you what, we'll reset the time because Mr. Bergeron asked a very, very good question, I think, and so he deserves to. Do you want, Mr. Bergeron, would you say a few words and see if Mr. Manthorpe is getting the translation?
Je croyais que toutes les...
I thought the test had been done from the start, Mr. Chair. Either way, can you hear the interpreter now?
There's a little globe at the bottom that if you click on that, it gives
just,
you...
I've got it. I've got it there. I've got it now. It had checked off. So let's try it again, please. I'm sorry about this. It should be fine now.
Alors,
Mr. Chair, Mr. Manthorpe, can you hear me? Can you hear the interpretation? Great. So first off, you might have heard about rumors in the media stating there was a report from an NGO organization called Safeguard Defenders, a human rights organization, according to which the sort of police service stations, in a way, would have been set up in the Greater Toronto Area. My first question is, how do you respond to these rumors? And second, if this is true, how should Canada respond?
Thank you very much. Yeah, a good question indeed. I think these rumors are indeed true. There was efforts a few years ago, and I think I referred to it in my book. The consulate in Vancouver asked formally to be able to have Chinese police stationed in Vancouver to help and protect Chinese tourists while they were visiting Canada. It was obviously rejected, but they appear not to have taken the hint. I think it's quite unacceptable, obviously, that to have these sort of secret police stations established in Canada. I doubt very much if it's just in Toronto. I would suspect they're probably also in Vancouver. The notion that they are simply there so that Chinese people can renew their driving licenses and so forth is a nonsense. That sort of thing is properly done through the consulate if need be. And I think that our law and justice systems need to root out these clandestine police operations and evict them. I think it should be as simple as that. We can't have other police forces running around in Canada, not just from China, but from anywhere else.
My second question is for Mr. Yude. In a podcast from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, you raised the issue of the People's Republic of China's influence within the World Health Organization. You refer to Canada's or the middle powers' roles or parts they could play to convince the People's Republic of China to give Taiwan a strengthened status within the World Health Organization. And you said it was by using discreet, sort of soft diplomacy in a way. You might have heard about some issues that have come up between Canada and the People's Republic of China over the last few months and last few years. How do you think Canada can play a useful role in strengthening Taiwan's position and the acceptance of that very fact by the PRC within the World Health Organization?
Thank you for that. That's an incredibly important issue. And it will be a challenge at this moment. That's just the absolute truth. There are the geopolitics are not really in favor of the sort of cooperative relationships that are going to be necessary in order to address any sort of future pandemics. The potential upside is with these so-called middle powers. So your Canadas, your Australias, your to some extent you could even look at Germany, but we could also look at some of the rising middle powers, some of the newly industrializing and democratizing countries, particularly in Asia, that might be able to have some degree of influence and be able to help lower some of the temperatures that exist, particularly when we're looking at the relationships between the United States and China. The United States does not have the influence over China right now that would allow for a cooperative relationship. While there are definitely some incredible tensions that exist between Canada and China right now, that is probably more likely to have some sort of opportunity and some particularly if it can be coupled with some sort of opportunity for scientific exchange, bearing in mind the same sorts of concerns, though, that Mr. Manthorp has brought up about how that information that could be gleaned through these exchanges might then be used. But that sense of transparency, that sense of trust, and that opportunity for engagement is going to be key, and something that the middle powers, the countries like Canada, have an opportunity to do far better than, say, the United States would have.
Reste-t-il, Monsieur le Président?
How much time do I have left, Mr. Chair? Quickly, Mr. Manthorp, in June, or rather last August, the Prime Minister said he intended to create a special team to fight misinformation and Russian propaganda. The former counselor, Charles Burton, in the embassy in China, wondered why limit this to Russia. He says, I quote, "These are conspiracy theories also in Chinese language in Canada. It's a threat to our democracy. This has already cost seats for members of parliament of Chinese origins during the last elections." This, to me, seems weighted, very striking. Why would we stop at Russia then, Mr. Manthorp?
For a short answer to a long question.
You're quite right, and we shouldn't. We are in a situation where almost all the Chinese language media in Canada now is under the control of the Chinese Communist Party, and we need to find a way of doing something about it.
Thank you, Mr. Bergeron. Now to Ms. McPherson for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I would like to thank our witnesses today. This has been frightening, of course, but also very informative. So thank you for your testimony so far. Mr. Manthorp, I guess one of my questions that I have is that, we do understand that we do need to have a trading relationship with China. I think what we saw with Jinping and his consolidation of power, the purging of rivals from within the party, that this is heading in the wrong direction, clearly. However, knowing that we do have to have that relationship, what should the diplomacy look like? We were very it was unfortunate, but we did not have a diplomat in China for the past 9 months, for 9 months in the last year, because Ambassador Barton left the position, of course, in what I would say is probably pretty stinky circumstances, where he went to work with Rio Tinto. What should our diplomacy look like? What should Canadian diplomacy with China look like right now?
I think it needs to be, well, I'm not a diplomat, although I know I have many friends who are diplomats. I think it needs to be pretty stern. I think it needs to recognize that rebuilding a working relationship with Beijing, even a minimalist working relationship with Beijing, is going to take a lot of time and a lot of trust building, because we're in a situation where every diplomat and every business person who is in China is under threat of being kidnapped if the relationship goes off the rails again. So I think that we need to be just very stern, very clear that our expectations are pretty minimalist at this point, and we need a lot of reassurance from Beijing before there can be anything much in terms of a working relationship. It's a tough post for any diplomat at the moment, and I don't envy them. But it's a moment where we have to keep our elbows out and be tough and about it, and there is no relationship going to be rebuilt very easily. Certainly not one that the Canadian people will follow and acknowledge. And I think that perhaps this is a moment where diplomats and politicians need to listen to more to the feelings of the Canadian people on the relationship with the Chinese Communist Party.
Do you think Canada has been tough to date? Do you think that Canada has do you think we can't, that is something that is a reasonable expectation from our diplomatic teams?
I think that there has been a lot of confusion in the last 3-4 years since Meng Wanzhou was detained. There's been a lot of confusion about how to respond, and both governments and business and academia have suddenly found that what they thought was a solid relationship is not, and they've been struggling to find both how to deal with it. I mean, I know diplomats and business people who have had traditionally solid relationships with Beijing, who have gone there to try and ease the situation and have come away totally perplexed at finding all the doors closed against them. But I begin in the last few weeks, actually, I've begun to feel that the decision makers in Ottawa and in business and in academia have begun to get a grip on the reality at the moment. And I think probably events with the party Congress, the relationship, the worsening relationship between Beijing and the United States, and the threats over Taiwan in parallel with what's happening between Russia and Ukraine have opened a lot of people's eyes to the difficulties of the situation that we face at the moment.
Canada right now, I sit on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and we are currently looking at some forced labor legislation, some slave labor legislation that I hope will be strong, that will be equal to what we are seeing coming out of other countries, Germany, the EU, other democracies. What do you think the impacts of us having that legislation and enforcing that legislation, which we have been woefully poor at in the past, what will the implications of that be on our relationship with China?
Well, they won't like it, but look, here we are. We are going at the moment through all sorts of internal discussions about slavery 200 years ago, and here we are going to our big box stores and buying stuff that is made by slave labor today. And so, I mean, I applaud the legislation, and it should be enforced and enforced rigorously. There is absolutely no justification whatsoever, any conceivable justification for Canadians to be offered stuff in Canadian stores that is made by slave labor. And it must be enforced rigorously. And if Beijing doesn't like it, then tough.
Time for a very short question and answer.
You know what? I have a question for Mr. Young, but I'll save it for the next round. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll now go to Mr. Chong for 5 minutes or less.
I think it was
Oh, did I get that wrong? Okay.
Mr. Seaback.
Oh, Mr. Seaback. Sure. Yes, we can go to Mr. Seaback. There
That's
you
great.
are.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Manthorpe, I'm going to ask you this question. In your comments, you said the Meng Wanzhou affair shows that they care more about one high-level party aristocrat than the entire relationship with Canada. Is this the new norm of relations with China? Was this a message to Canada and other countries? And was it potentially exacerbated by the SNC Lavalin matter, where it appeared that there was some attempt to interfere in a prosecution, like a deferred prosecution agreement? Was that an exacerbating factor, that's why this happened? Or do you think this is just the new norm of how China is going to do business with Canada and other countries?
I basically think it's the new norm. I basically think it's the new norm. Whether there was some hope that a political accommodation could be made, I think that's probably more than likely. Whether it referred specifically to the Lavalin affair, I just don't know. I mean, I think you can look back. There was an earlier instance where a spy for the PRC was detained here on a warrant from the US, and he decided not to go through the process, and instead he decided that he'd rather be extradited to the US and start a new life there. So, I mean, we all know, and it's very clear from the history, that there is always a political element at the end of an extradition process here. So I have no doubt that Ms. Meng and her lawyers had that in mind, but I would be loath to tie it particularly to the Lavalin affair. I don't think that I don't know, but I think there was plenty of other reasons for them to think that there could be a political accommodation at the end.
When we talk about trade, because you certainly talked about that, saying we can't have normal trade relations. How should Canada approach their trade relations? I know it's got to be transactional, but is there any more depth, or can you put a little more flesh on that?
Well, you know, it's an interesting one, and I won't take up your time, but very quickly, I was asked after the sanctions on the export of Canadian pork to go on a radio station in Saskatchewan. I did a bit of research. They were worried in Saskatchewan because they said China is the largest market for Canadian pork, which in weight is quite true, but in value, it's Japan. And I think that you can find many other instances where actually the importance of our trade relationship and our exports to China are overstated. For example, The Economist did a report last year which showed that it ranked all countries by the importance to them of their exports to China. Canada was 47th on that list. By and large, our exports to China are not nearly as important as they tend to be portrayed. And so I think that we can keep it to a transactional minimalist business. They want to buy our wheat, our grains, our meat, then fine. Here's the contract, sign on the dotted line. But I don't think that we need to get more involved than that.
I know you wrote an article about this in 2017, I believe. I assume your position hasn't changed.
No. In fact, it's intensified.
You mentioned the United Front is intimidating Chinese Canadians. You've certainly talked about the influence it has over Chinese Canadian media. I've got, I think, about 50 seconds. Do you have anything more that you would add to what things should we put in place to try and confront this or eliminate this?
Well, I'll just say very quickly, I think you're going to hear from Alex Neve. I think he's going to be former head of Amnesty International, who I think is going to give evidence. He's a man who has been through all of these and verified many of them. I would defer to him on that question. He's very much the expert on the breadth and depth of those intrusions.
Very short question. Time for it. You're finished? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Seebeck. We'll then go to Mr. Frangoscatos for 5 minutes or less.
Thank you, Chair. Professor Yude, if I could begin with you. I take your points on middle powers and what they could potentially do on this question of global health policy. And I think the pandemic has made very real the need to engage internationally with like-minded allies, and even towards countries where we don't share values, but certainly health cuts across and points to the need for any cooperation. But with respect to China, President Xi, and this past weekend made it even more clear, is looking inward and not outward. So what are the options on the table for middle powers that want to engage on this question of global health policy, but look to China and potentially I don't think they see a partner. You can't talk to someone that won't talk back to you and have a conversation with you, a meaningful one. Or are there other creative ways around that? Are there ways that middle powers can get around that? I think you kind of implied that there are possibilities, but I wonder if you could expand on that.
Sure. Thanks for the question. It is a difficult moment to try to engage in this sort of dialogue for exactly the reason that you pointed out. President Xi has shown an inclination towards looking inward. One of the things that I think can be done is making the overtures to at least show that there is this good faith effort to try to engage. If for no other reason, with the possibility of being able to name and shame. That's one of the rare powers that the WHO really has, is to try to name and shame countries that aren't in compliance. So extending that effort, I think, can be important. Working with some of the countries, particularly some of the countries that have even stronger relationships with China, particularly the regional partners and the regional neighbors, they may be able to have a degree of influence that a Canada or an Australia or other countries may not be able to have. That could be another opportunity. And I think we do also just need to recognize that there could be some opportunities, and we have seen some opportunities on a scattershot level of this sort of scientific diplomacy. Now, of course, that gets complicated because when information that the Chinese government hasn't wanted to get out gets out, that there has been retribution that has been exacted against those individuals and those organizations. So there's no panacea, unfortunately. There's no easy way to do it, but the continued efforts are going to be crucial for trying to make those sorts of inroads.
Thank you very much. If I could go to Mr. Manthorpe with the final question. Sir, you've written at great length on the rise of right-wing nationalism and populism in particular. You said the following in a relatively recent op-ed. Even though Canada has not been struck as hard or wounded so dangerously as some other democracies, there are plenty of warning signs for our political and pundit classes to take seriously. Again, that's in reference to right-wing nationalism and populism. What are the implications of that observation, sir, for Canadian foreign policy, specifically relating to the question of Canada-China relations?
Yeah, I haven't thought about it strictly in those terms. I think you're referring to a book I wrote, in fact, after Claws of the Panda, a book called Restoring Democracy. I'm actually a little more concerned about the state of democracy in Canada and the future of democracy in Canada than I was when I wrote that book now 2 years ago. I think we need to examine it very thoroughly. But yes, I think that on foreign policy, of course, I mean that will, if we find ourselves gripped by right-wing nationalism, that will affect our foreign policy as well. I don't see it being quite as dangerous here as it is, say, in the United States and in some parts of Europe, such as Hungary and under certain circumstances, Poland. But it's something that we need. I think we need basically to recognize that democracy, our democracy, needs constant tending. And I think that we've been too lackadaisical over the last 20, 30 years, and we need to really sit down and recognize. And I think probably after the pandemic, after COVID, which exposed so many both good things and weaknesses, this would be a good moment to really sit down and think about where Canadian democracy goes from here.
Mr. Fragasatos, you're unfortunately out of time. We'll finish the round. We'll take the time necessary. Mr. Bergeron, 2.5 minutes for you, sir.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I almost feel like asking Mr. Manthorpe, to what extent does the monarchy reassure him about the state of our democracy here in Canada? But I'll avoid doing that. In testimony before the special committee on in April 2021, Catherine Bartholomew, president of the the U.S.-China Security Committee, said that individuals had to sign up at the Department of Justice under the Foreign Agents Registration Act. Do you think it would be relevant for Canada to have something similar in terms of legislation? How effective would that be?
I think it would be. A very important step. I mean, I think it's important to know who is doing what in our country, and having a registration of foreign agents is, I think, probably the first primary step, and then setting out boundaries of what those agents can and can't do in our country. So yeah, no, I think a registry is a necessary first step.
Une question rapide.
Quick question for Mr. Youd. Taiwan's non-participation in the World Health Organization, to what extent would that have an effect on global efforts to prevent the occurrence of new pandemics, or if not, or even other efforts that we would globally have to fight other pandemics?
Taiwan's inclusion would be incredibly important. And if for no other reason, during the SARS pandemic, Taiwan had the second highest number of cases. And the fact that we had to go through the People's Republic of China government in order to have any sort of engagement between the Taiwanese government and the World Health Organization caused a huge delay. Similarly, when we're looking at COVID-19, Taiwan was incredibly blessed that it had a vice president who was an epidemiologist. That is the sort of expertise and the sort of knowledge that would be incredibly important for helping to stop the spread and look at the sorts of efforts that might be effective at reducing the spread of an infectious disease. So it is definitely a challenge, but unfortunately, everything has to go through the People's Republic of China right now, and they are understandably incredibly reluctant to do so, to the point where they have even blocked Taiwan from participating in the annual World Health Assembly, which takes place every May in Geneva and is like a parliament for global health. Having these sorts of insights from Taiwan, having all the parts of the globe represented are going to be incredibly important if we're going to be able to effectively stop the next pandemic.
Thank you, Mr. Youd. We'll now go to Ms. McPherson for the final 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Youd. And I agree with you on that last comment you made. I also think it's very important that Taiwan be able to share their expertise on things like the Sustainable Development Goals and, a range of different things that are so important and that Taiwan has taken leadership on. I'm concerned. I mean, we are hearing testimony today that Canada needs to diplomatically be more stern or put our elbows up, I think was one of the quotes that I heard. And yet, on the other hand, I'm hearing you, Mr. You talk about the need for China to be at the table because of those major gaps that would be exposed if they weren't there. So I'd love to just finish off by getting some more information from you on, first of all, what are those gaps? How do we ensure that we are balancing that? What does that balance look like between stern diplomacy versus the need to have China at the table as we talk about health? And then I guess finally, as we see a China that is looking more inward, how trustworthy is the information that we are receiving from China as well? That's a lot. Good luck.
Oh my good. A lot to do in 2.5 minutes. To take the second point first, this is a classic case of trust but verify. This is why we need to have multiple sets of eyes involved, because it is important to get the information that is coming from official sources. It's also important to make sure that we can triangulate that information and that we can trust it and we can operate effectively on it. The inward focus that the Chinese government is engaging in now, that's not going to that's not going to keep them safe in terms of future pandemics. And that's just the reality of the movement of goods and people across borders. But also, if we look historically, if we look at the outbreaks of things like COVID, like SARS, like some of the influenza outbreaks that we've had, they have come from China in that region. And that's not to, that's just a quirk of geography in many respects, but it also means that it's all the more important that we have those opportunities for that sort of information, that we can conduct that surveillance, not because we're trying to spy or do anything nefarious. It's because if we know when outbreaks are happening, if we know how that spread is starting to begin in those patterns, we can address these concerns more effectively and more quickly, and we can get the World Health Organization, the other organizations involved. So I don't know that it's so much a choice between being stern and bringing them to the table, but it's about, as you point out, it's about how do we strike that balance, because we do need to have a stern measure, but we can't be so stern that it completely closes China off, because that puts all of us at further risk.
With that, we're to the end of our first panel, but fascinating one it was. Mr. Yude, Mr. Manthorp, delighted to have you here. I know the second one is going to be wonderful as well. I'm sure if you asked nicely, you could, stay on and listen in if you wish. Or I think this is being televised, is it not, Nancy, somewhere?
We're televised.
Yeah, we're televised, so there you go. If you can find that, you're still in business. We will take a brief break. We're going to do another sound check with Mr. Hamilton, and hopefully we'll be back in a few minutes with the second panel. Thank you. Professor of Public Ethics, Charles Sturt University, Canberra campus. And then we also have online Stephen Nagy, Senior Associate Professor, International Christian University, and Senior Research Fellow, the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And here joining us in person tonight is Alex Neve, Senior Fellow, Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, the University of Ottawa. I'll tell you what, Mr. Hamilton, let's see if you can give us a statement, but if not, we do have it printed, so we won't lose that piece if the audio quality isn't good. But we'll start the clock at 5 minutes, but I may have to interrupt.
Thank you, Chair, and apologies for the technical troubles. It's a pleasure to appear before the committee.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry, sir. It's just not going to work. So,
okay.
I'm wondering if he could try turning his camera off to see if there's a possibility we could hear him, a bandwidth issue in the transmission from Australia. Sometimes that helps.
It does, yes, yes.
Is that any better, Chair? I've turned the camera off now.
No, it is not, sir, I'm afraid. Okay. So you can turn your camera back on so we can see you. You know, as I say, we have your statement printed out, so that's available to us. I'll advise the members to ask questions, but if we can pose on you to provide us written answers, that would be
Mr. Chair, point of order. Have we received the statement as members?
I'm told we did. Did we not receive?
We have received the English copy.
Oh, you've received the English copy.
So could I ask, when it's been translated, it be circulated to all members and be entered as evidence into our study?
Absolutely. Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
And the answers can be also appended.
Yes, and we will make sure that the answers that we receive written will be translated and passed on appropriately. That said, though, it's unfortunate because we'll also be in our committee business offering some instructions to our analysts for a report. So we'll have to make the best of it, I suppose. So with that, Mr. Nagy, we'll go to you for an opening statement, 5 minutes or less, please, sir.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to share my views. Just to give you a bit of background, I'm based in Tokyo. I've lived in Tokyo, and I see China relations and Canada-China relations from Tokyo, but I've also spent 5 years in Hong Kong as well. I'd like to start with a statement, and I think it's really important. The cardinal rule of diplomacy is never to make binary choices. And I think this is really critical as we discuss Canada-China relations and how we move forward. In 2021, according to Statistics Canada's report, all our agricultural product trade went up with China. That agricultural relationship and the export of other raw materials to China continues to deepen despite record unfavorable ratings. And I think this is really important. It places us in a position of thinking about what are the economic benefits of a relationship with China and the realities of the politics. Second, I think we have many challenges globally and regionally that we need to be thinking about in terms of bilateral, in terms of our relationship with China. Whether we're thinking about non-traditional security issues such as transnational diseases, whether we're thinking about environmental problems, China will be part of that solution. And as a result, we need to find and build bridges. Notwithstanding, I would like to focus on 3 specific points that I think are really critical to thinking about Canada-China relations. First, China's broad intentions to weaken international institutions, redefine how we understand democracy, redefine how we understand human rights, and redefine how we think about rule of law. Second, and I think importantly, is the political influence campaigns within Canada that particularly target ethnic Chinese Canadians and how it influences our democracy, and it creates challenges in terms of creating coherent, rational and fact-based policy to build a productive yet awkward coexistence with China. Third, and I think really importantly, is to clearly understand China's intentions within the Indo-Pacific region, and that is to reorganize the regional security architecture so that states, like-minded states like Japan, South Korea, Australia, defer to Beijing's wishes before they consider their own priorities within the region. With that, I think Canada has a deep interest in working with like-minded countries, whether it's the United States, Japan, Australia, South Korea, in strengthening collaboration on building a rules-based order. And that means working within the United Nations, working within the International Monetary Fund, working within the World Health Organization to ensure that it's a rules-based, transparent process of how we protect this international system that protects middle powers such as Canada from a might of is right approach to foreign policy. On my second point, in terms of political influence campaigns within Canada, and Canada is not only a victim of this, of course, Australia and others as well, it's really critical that we protect our Chinese Canadian citizens, but also ensure that our Canadian businesses, as they interact with China, are thinking about Canadian interests. This means increasing transparency with regards to Chinese language media, understanding who are the owners of those Chinese language media resources, and understanding and creating much more Chinese literacy amongst the ethnic Chinese community within Canada, but amongst the Canadian community in general about the kinds of operations that the United Front Work Department is deploying in Canada to shape our political choices and, of course, shape our relations with China. The third area that I think is really important is to understand the importance of a stronger forward-leaning presence in the Indo-Pacific region that does support a rules-based order. About $5.5 trillion of trade goes through the South China Sea, East China Sea, in and around Taiwan. Of that, about $25 billion of Canadian trade is moving in and out of the region. Any kind of friction within the region, a cross-strait contingency in which China pursues a reunification, will fundamentally affect the regional economy, but of course, Canadian economic interests within the region. It's critically important that we work with like-minded partners such as Japan, the United States, South Korea, and Australia to engage in what we call transit operations, ensuring that maritime domain awareness is robust, but also identifies the challenges that the Chinese are making in terms of gray zone operations, lawfare operations, and of course the use of force. It's critical that Canada continues to engage with China, engages through key lines of cooperation such as environmental cooperation, trade, thinking about non-traditional security cooperation on transnational diseases, piracy, illegal fishing. But at the same time, we need to draw strong lines. We need to encourage transparency at home and in our bilateral relations. And we need to increase the literacy of Canadians and Canadian politicians about what's happening with regards to China, Canadian relations, but the broader Indo-Pacific region.
Thank you, Mr. Nagy. I think we'll have to call it for time there, but you'll have more to say, and I'm sure you'll work it into some of your answers. Now we'll go to Mr. Neve for 5 minutes or less.
In front of the special committee this evening. Perhaps no surprise, my primary message to you is a simple one, and it is that a strong commitment to human rights must be at the very heart of all aspects of our relationship with China. And I'd like to offer 4 recommendations to take that a bit further. And I'm not going to focus on any of the many groups that are at grave human rights risk every single day in China, including Uyghurs, Tibetans, the people of Hong Kong, Falun Gong practitioners, human rights defenders, pro-democracy advocates. Of course, we could spend the entire session focusing in on any of those groups, and I've had that opportunity in the past. My recommendations this evening are more overarching. The first is that we need much more concerted action on behalf of Canadians who are unjustly imprisoned in China, as well as for the relatives of Canadians who have fled persecution in China and are stranded abroad seeking reunion and resettlement with their family. This should include perhaps appointing a special envoy dedicated to taking up these kinds of cases when Canadians and permanent residents are imprisoned in China in contravention of international human rights norms. I think, of course, of Hussein Khalil, a Uyghur Canadian citizen who's been imprisoned for more than 16 years and has not seen his 4 children grow up in Burlington. His family's had no news of him for 5 years. I think of Sun Qian, a Canadian citizen and Falun Gong practitioner, imprisoned since 2017, sentenced to an 8-year prison term in 2020. Supposedly voluntarily, she has renounced her Canadian citizenship and there's been no news of her for the last 2 years. I think of Ayub Mohammed, Salahuddin Abdulahad, and Khalil Mahmoud, 3 Uyghur men who escaped China in 2001. They were turned over to U.S. forces in Afghanistan by bounty hunters and ended up in Guantanamo Bay. But after several years of that dystopian injustice, were cleared by the U.S. government, resettled over a decade ago through absurd diplomatic deals to Bermuda and Albania. They are all married to Canadian women or Canadian citizens or permanent residents. They all have Canadian children. They, for years, have been seeking reunion with their family here in Canada, and that has been blocked at every turn. We can do much better. Second, picking up on Jonathan Manthorpe's comments, we must more directly confront the harassment of human rights defenders in Canada working to uphold human rights in China, particularly with respect to Uyghurs, Tibet, Hong Kong, and Falun Gong. These unlawful and sometimes violent actions against activists in Canada emanate from the Chinese government and its agents. Now we have added to the mix the reported establishment of these 3 police service stations mentioned earlier in at least 3 locations in Canada. The intimidation extends to family in China. Uyghur Canadians tell of their relatives being detained and threatened in retaliation for their activism in Canada. Tibetan Canadians tell of being forced to sign forms renouncing the Dalai Lama if they wish to be granted visas to travel to visit their loved ones. The intended impact is clear: to frighten activists and community members into silence. Amnesty International, on behalf of the Canadian Coalition for Human Rights in China, has prepared 2 comprehensive reports on this in 2017 and 2020 with numerous recommendations for the Canadian government, and there's really, sadly, been very little progress. And now, activists increasingly do not even bother to report incidents. They find it too confusing to ascertain where to turn to, or they're dispirited by past attempts that have gone nowhere. Civil society has laid out a blueprint for action, which we can get into in the questions if you'd like to. Third, we need a whole-of-government human rights action plan to guide the Canada-China relationship. Concern about human rights in China cannot be limited to the Human Rights Desk at Global Affairs. Human rights are implicated in all aspects of that relationship: trade, environment, health, natural resources, national security, and so much more. We need that human rights action plan. We've needed it for years, that cuts across the entirety of government and, ideally, would draw in provincial, territorial, and municipal governments as well. And finally, there's an urgently growing need to devote dedicated, expert resources to advancing a serious multilateral strategy with respect to China and human rights. China has long been adept at escaping scrutiny, let alone consequences on the world stage, for the country's abysmal human rights record. Other governments are cajoled, they're hoodwinked, even threatened into voting against the very few attempted UN-level resolutions that have come forward over the years. Earlier this month, of course, a resolution proposing a debate at the UN Human Rights Council about the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights' recent report on the Uyghur situation was defeated. Only 17, that's just over 1/3 of the members of the UN Human Rights Council, voted in favor of that resolution.
Mr. Neve, I'm afraid we've gone into questioning time, so I better get to that. And for that, I will turn to Mr. Chong for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just going to ask 4 very quick questions for Mr. Hamilton, Professor Hamilton, that I hope he can respond to the clerk and you, Mr. Chair, in writing. So my first question is, Australia's National Counter-Foreign Interference Coordinator has now been in place since 2018. What is the role of the coordinator and how effective has the office been in combating foreign interference? My second question is, Australia is generally seen as a model for Western nations in addressing the threat of foreign interference. What can Canada learn from Australia in order to build resilience against PRC foreign interference? And the other question is, of all the recent measures taken by Australia to counter PRC foreign interference, which have been most effective? And Mr. Chair, my fourth question for Professor Hamilton is, does not joining AUKUS, the recent defense treaty between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, and Canada not being a member of the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, does that not represent a missed opportunity for Canada? Why or why not? So those are the four questions, Mr. Chair, that I'd like Professor Hamilton to respond to. And now I'd like to ask Mr. Nev some questions. You mentioned human rights should be at the center of our policy, our approach to the People's Republic of China. You mentioned the establishment of 3 illegal police stations here in the Greater Toronto Area. I have a question related to state-controlled broadcasters getting government licenses here in Canada. There's been evidence that these state-controlled broadcasters from China have actually violated human rights by broadcasting the coerced and forced confessions of prisoners of conscience. As you know as well, several months ago, the CRTC pulled Russia Today, RT, off the air because it is a state-controlled broadcaster spreading disinformation and in some cases maybe even violating international law with what they've been doing. And so I'm wondering if you think that the CRTC licenses of state-controlled broadcasters from China operating here in Canada should be revoked.
So I won't take a definite yes or no position because I'm not sufficiently familiar with those. I'm very much aware of the allegations and concerns. What is evident, though, is there absolutely cannot be a double standard here. There were very clear and compelling and cogent reasons for the decision to revoke the Russian license. And that should not only apply because we have heightened concern and scrutiny now with respect to Russia in the midst of the Ukraine crisis. Those same concerns and approach and standards and principles should be applied to Chinese state-owned media as well. And absolutely, we should be looking very closely at any concerns that any of that media is a vehicle for propagating, advancing, promoting human rights violations.
Yeah, just to be clear for the record, Mr. Chair, I'm not at all in favor of banning any print media or any non-CRTC media because I believe in the fundamental freedom of expression. I think it's a dangerous thing for the government to ban free expression and print media, but I certainly don't believe that the government of Canada is under any obligation to grant a license to operate on government-owned airwaves, government-regulated airwaves, to a state-controlled broadcaster like those operating from either Russia or China. I have another second question before I run out of time. You mentioned in your second recommendation that harassment of the countering of the harassment of human rights defenders here in Canada needs to be a priority. And we know that that has taken place. We recently even seen in the United Kingdom people protesting at the consulate in Manchester were like violently assaulted by accredited diplomatic staff before British police intervened and stopped the physical assault. And so we know here that pro-democracy activists, pro-Hong Kong democracy activists have been harassed, that people defending the rights of Uyghurs and Tibetans have been harassed by people acting, proxies acting on behalf of Beijing. So what are the one or two things that the government isn't doing that it should be doing to better protect the safety of those Canadians here?
Well, I referenced the fact that 2 fairly comprehensive reports were put in front of the government in 2017 and 2020 with a number of recommendations. This was prepared by Amnesty International, but it was on behalf of the Canadian Coalition for Human Rights in China, which comprises Uyghur, Tibetan, Falun Gong, Hong Kong groups. It's a very wide-ranging coalition. And some of those recommendations were very simple, things that really could have been advanced in a few months. For instance, one of the things that activists find the most frustrating and very disappointing is the response from law enforcement or security agencies when they do seek something has happened, whether it's intimidation, something that's happened by the way of online surveillance, or even something that has perhaps involved an act of violence. And they are frequently sent from one agency to another. It's not really for the RCMP, it's municipal police. It's not really a policing matter. You should go to CSIS. It's not really intelligence. Why don't you raise it with Foreign Affairs? And people give up. So a recommendation was made that there's the need for what we called a central clearinghouse, but really an office that is going to coordinate the efforts of departments and agencies that all have a piece of this pie.
Now we'll
because
have to
right now,
pause there.
It is scattered and ineffective.
Mr. Neve, but Mr. Chong is out of time, a little bit more than out of time, in fact, but that's okay. We'll now go to Mr. Oliphant, who will be, I'm sure, given the same latitude.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both the witnesses for being here tonight. I want to begin with Professor Nagy. And I'm just sorting out a couple of your remarks. You said in your remarks that it was important for Canada to work with allies, the United States, Japan, and Australia, and others you mentioned in our geopolitical strategy and in sorting out our relationship with China. You've also written that it's important for Canada to differentiate from the United States in our approach on the Indo-Pacific, which includes China. So I'm just wondering where that is. Is one on national security issues or international security issues, the other on trade and commerce? Or where should we be, in your opinion, aligned, and where should we differentiate with you, particularly the United States? Unmute, I think, probably. It's the 2022 problem. We all get it.
Yes, thank you very much for your question. I think it's critical for us to continue to ensure that we are an independent stakeholder with regards to our bilateral relationship with China, but also our relationships within the Indo-Pacific. And there is a danger that if we align too closely with the United States, in particular on a securitized approach to dealing with China, that we will become another victim of U.S. policy. China understands that, and they use often the expression that you kill the chicken to scare the monkeys, and that they understand that the best way to pull apart a U.S. Approach to the region is to work on its weaker partners, and the weaker partners include Canada, it includes Australia, it includes South Korea to a certain degree, and it includes European countries. We need to ensure that as we engage with China, that we need to have a policy that is less securitized than the United States, find opportunities to use Canadian diplomacy to work with China. But at the same time, I think it's very critical that, again, we work with the United States, Japan, Australia, and other partners in concerted ways to promote trade, to promote a rules-based order, to fight against human rights violations within the region, and to really send the message to China that as we work to shape its behavior, that Canada does have a slightly different approach. And I think that is going to continue to be important so that we can build an awkward coexistence with a rising state that really does have values that are different than us.
Next question will be to both you, and it builds on that one, because tonight we've been hearing conflicting testimony, and Ms. McPherson sort of raised it as well. We've been hearing one witness tonight said that we should have no diplomatic relations with China, but then also said we should reconstruct our relationship with China, so I'm kind of confused what he really meant. Yet last week, a professor from Queen's told us it's not a question of whether or not we have a relationship with China, because it exists, it's large, it is influential, it's how we have a relationship with China. And I'm just trying to understand that, because also in the context of health tonight, we heard that it was absolutely critical for the health of our global population that we find a way to work with China because of its significance in issues of health. And we hear that we should withdraw or sometimes actually isolate China. So for both of you, just trying to work out that dichotomy. I'm kind of on dichotomies tonight, and I have about a minute for both of you, or a minute and a bit for both of you to comment on that.
So it's a country of 1.4 billion. It's a country of 1.4 billion people. We have shared interests in dealing with environmental issues, in dealing with health issues. We have to find a way to work with China. It has considerable resources that can be used to deal with these challenges. And I think that those are clear areas or crosswalks that Canada can engage with China. But of course, there's red lines where we need to be very, very upfront. We need to be transparent, and we need to ensure that China understands that on human rights, on interference in our democracy, on interference in the democracies of like-minded countries like Japan, like Australia, that we will stand by our partners to ensure that the system that we have benefited from and is core to our prosperity remains intact.
I'm going to, Mr. Neve.
Not have a relationship with China. It's in no one's interests, including the many communities in China whose human rights are so fragile and violated every day. I think it is a question of the nature of that relationship. I'd go back to my core message is that we have to go much further in very deliberately and thoughtfully putting human rights at the center of all aspects of that relationship. We have some tremendous work that has been done. I've seen it firsthand over the years by diplomats both in the Pearson building and at our embassy who have the human rights file, but far too often other corners of the relationship, which extend probably across literally every single government department, pay hardly any attention at all to human rights. I think there's a lot of opportunities that are missed there. And if that defined the relationship, then I think we'd feel much better about what it looked like.
You mentioned the disappointing vote with the Human Rights Council, the UN Human Rights Council.
Your microphone.
That signal to me was we have a long piece of work to do with allies and friends and not like-mindeds. Do you agree on that?
Absolutely. And I think that's why I was starting to say we need an expert and well-resourced multilateral strategy, because I think far too often what we see is there's kind of a bit of a mad scramble every time an opportunity or a challenge arises at the UN Human Rights Council or somewhere else. And it's not part of a well-planned, long-term, proactive strategy where we're really trying to put pieces in place to start to take China on meaningfully in some of those settings.
Thank you. Thank you,
With
Mr.
that,
Chair.
thank you very much. Mr. Bergeron, it's to you for 6 minutes.
Merci, monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for being here with us this evening. Mr. Nagy, I'll start by getting back to an answer you provided to the first question Mr. Oliphant posed. You said that the PRC is focusing on these weakest allies of the United States, knowing that the most vulnerable or weakest U.S. partners are clearly being targeted by the PRC that is trying to isolate them. Would it not actually be an argument in favor of a rapprochement, a closer coordination with the United States?
Thank you very much for the question. And I think that, again, we need to engage in a nuanced approach in how we work with the United States when it comes to our partner, how we engage with China. China does understand that U.S. allies like the United States, like Australia, even European countries are much more vulnerable to Chinese coercion. And if we work too closely and we have an over-securitized relationship with the United States as it comes to China, that it will put Canadians and Canadian businesses in a position where they could be coerced or they could be used as leverage for that relationship. I think the cases of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavro are a very good example of how Canadians were used to change the relationship and to weaken the partnership with the United States and Canada. We were fortunate that we were able to come out of China eventually, but again, the relationship with the United States and the choices that we make with the United States need to be highly calibrated and nuanced. Strengthening a securitized relationship with China will put Canadian businesses and Canadians in danger in China. And this is why I think we need to continue to think about how we can have a Canadian approach that complements the United States, but also very much understands how we could be leveraged to put pressure on the United States.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. Chair, I'll admit that I'm still not quite grasping the nuance that Mr. Nagy is trying to express, because what he's saying seems to be for strengthening a relationship with the United States. But either way, let's move on to another question. Since the establishment of this special committee in the last parliament, 3 foreign affairs ministers have come before us. Now we're at the third. We're at our third minister. First minister was Minister Champagne, and he promised a new China policy. And here we are. There's no more talk of a new policy for China, but Indo-Pacific, an Indo-Pacific China policy, rather. Some people would critically say that it's a way for the government to sort of avoid the importance of actually having a policy on China. Others would say that it's a way of facilitating synergy between Indo-Pacific region states, and the purpose being to better affect the conduct of the People's Republic of China. What do you think of this, Mr. Nagy?
I think it's really critical for us to engage in with China through an Indo-Pacific strategy. China is part of the region. It is not the region. And as we engage in the region, we work with like-minded countries like Japan, like South Korea, like Australia, like Singapore, but also countries that do have different political systems like Vietnam. As we work with those partners, we can create a more robust, institutionalized, rules-based region that can potentially shape Chinese behavior over the long term. If Canada's not part of that, we use an expression, if it's not at the table in creating the regional rules and supporting the regional rules, it's on the menu. And I think this is a very, very critical part in how we engage with China, is by creating and shaping the Indo-Pacific region with like-minded countries that have significant resources that complement Canadian resources.
Thank you very much. Mr. Neve, my next question is for you. You closed off in your opening statements by saying that there was a vote in October at the Human Rights Council of the United Nations where there was a slim, there was the vote that took place. Agnès Calaignaris said that the vote, the main Human Rights Council within the United Nations seemed to ignore the advice of the actual office within the United Nations responsible for this. To what extent do you think this United Nations Council's vote is reflective of the PRC's sway within these international organizations, and to what extent is this testament to the strategy the People's Republic of China is having throughout the world?
Well, absolutely. I think it is very reflective of the growing influence of China in those institutions, within the Human Rights Council in particular. It's also more broadly reflective of other challenges that exist within the Council. It's not only reflective of China's role, but I think the degree to which China actively, energetically pulled out all the stops to make sure that that resolution was defeated tells us a lot. And it's why, to go back to my response to Mr. Oliphant's earlier question, I think Canada really needs to get in the game with our partners of developing and putting in place a very comprehensive, resourced, forward-looking strategy for how we're going to start to respond to that dysfunctional, divisive, undermining influence that we're seeing from China in those institutions.
Thank you very much. Ms. McPherson, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here this evening. I know it's late. I'd like to follow up on some of the questions that my colleague, Mr. Bergeron, has asked in terms of what that multilateral strategy would look like, Mr. Neve. Obviously, Canada can play a role. We do have sort of that diplomatic role, that sort of middle power role that we can play. But what exactly would that look like if we are trying to have a forward-looking strategy? If we are trying to make sure that we are not always on our heels when these things come up? Can you give me some more details on what Canada should do right now to make that happen?
Well, certainly this is not a strategy we develop on our own. I think it's a very clear example of a strategy that needs to be developed collaboratively with a number of partners, and not just the United States, Western Europe, and Australia. There are, and I think when we look at some of the voting patterns we've seen recently with respect to some of the statements dealing with Uyghurs and Hong Kong, et cetera, there are starting to be a few other countries willing to come to the table and be part of saying the right thing. So the strategy needs to be developed with them, because I think you're quite right. We on our own to just kind of sit, around a table here in Ottawa and craft a strategy for, how to deal with China at the UN Human Rights Council, that'll largely be ineffective. But it really needs to start to think about relationships, who can perhaps be brought on board, because we need a larger constituency of countries than the usual suspects who have been coming together so far. And I think bring some real experts into thinking this through.
Well, and we're talking about the Human Rights Council, but there is the other multilateral institutions where that same sort of consensus building or community building, I guess, is very, very important. One of the areas that, of course, I also see, and we've seen this with the vote to some degree, is the growing influence of China in sub-Saharan Africa as countries, other traditional partners with sub-Saharan African countries have stepped back. Can you talk a little bit about the implications of that and how we can counter that influence, I guess?
Well, that would have to be, I think, a key plank of the strategy, because there's no question that is a very real trend, and it's not just problematic within the Human Rights Council. We saw it. It was very problematic with respect to this vote, obviously. But China's economic footprint in sub-Saharan Africa is immense. It's being leveraged and used in a whole host of ways when it comes to those sorts of votes. And it sometimes feels like we're just kind of watching and letting it happen. And we need to come together with other countries who share that concern and come up with some meaningful strategies for how to respond to that, whether it is starting to more meaningfully respond to that growing presence on the ground in countries in sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, or kind of different approaches to relationship building within some of the institutions.
Yeah, and I would suggest that the abandonment of many of these countries by Canada and others has left this void that was very easy to be filled. Mr. Nagy, if I could ask you as well, I'm also concerned when we talk about China's growing influence. I'd love your thoughts on the growing influence of China in sub-Saharan Africa, but also the growing threat of China with regard to the Canadian Arctic region, if you could.
Thank you very much for the question. So in terms of sub-Saharan Africa, I think the primary influence that China is, deploying is, of course, anything related to aid, anything related to the Belt Road Initiative that does create dependent relationships through the provision of infrastructure connectivity within the region. Now, you mentioned sub-Saharan Africa. I think that we should be more concerned about areas such as the Congo, which are a supply of rare earth materials that the Chinese government is very intent on monopolizing those rare earth materials so they can capture the market and use that to pressure, again, allies of the United States that depend on those rare earth materials for the production of electronics, and they go in our vehicles and many things. So I think that the Belt Road Initiative is very critical. I think that we should be looking at where that's deployed in Africa and how it's related to monopolization of critical minerals. With regards to the Arctic, I think that this is premature to say that the Chinese are very, very proactive within the region. One, because of the lack of resources. Two, because of the lack of expertise. And three, they are challenged right now in terms of engaging within the region. I think most evidence suggests that they are eventually interested in acquiring resources in the Arctic, especially as global climate change does open up the Arctic Ocean, creating opportunities for resource exploitation. But how will they deploy resources? This is an open question at this particular time, and I don't think the evidence suggests that they have are intent on deploying military resources. Rather, they're in a premature stage of developing the expertise to exploit resources. How they will do that? Most likely, they will cooperate with Russia, and this will create more complications. And I think this is an area that we haven't brought up in today's discussion, but where is China and Russia in terms of their alignment on many different issues?
You have time for a very quick question and a quick answer.
These very quick questions. I'll save it for the next round. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. We'll now go to Ms. Dancho for 5 minutes or less.
Mr. Chair, thank you to the witnesses for being here. I've listened very intently to your expertise and your testimony today. Just going to start off with some questions for Professor Nagy. Professor Nagy, I'm just listening to what you're saying, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but you seem to be suggesting that we move away from aligning ourselves with our American allies in terms of security relationship in response to China, and move towards rather perhaps other allies, but also international institutions like the UN, the World Health Organization, and the IMF. Is that correct? Is that a correct assessment of what you've said?
No, I will reiterate, I think that it's really important that we cooperate with our closest ally, the United States, but we need to be also conscious that how the degree of cooperation that we engage with may open us up to being used as leverage in the US-China competition. And this happened with the arrest of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavro. I think that the economic coercion that happened against Australia is another example of this. And we need to be finding and threading the needle in terms of how we cooperate with the United States, but at the same time, find an independent way to engage.
Thank you very much. But you had said specifically that sort of if we do move closer to, I believe the word you keep using is securitized. I'm not quite sure, but I believe you're referring to our security relationship with the U.S. If we move closer and align ourselves more closely, you said that we can have Canadian businesses in danger in China. Is that not what you said?
Yes, I did.
Right. So you would disagree then that we should be pursuing relationships with AUKUS, for example, which, as you know, is a security agreement with the US, the UK, and Australia, or as well the quadrilateral security dialogue with India, Japan, Australia, and the US. We should, in your opinion, not be joining these?
No, and I've written explicitly about this. I said that Canada should cooperate with the quadrilateral security dialogue in an ad hoc functional way. There's not a membership in the Quad, but they should find ways to cooperate in terms of maritime security. If you follow the developments of the Quad, they're talking about technological cooperation, infrastructure, and connectivity cooperation. AUKUS as well. I think that the nuclear submarine aspect of AUKUS takes up a lot of media space, but the real area for Canadian cooperation is in AI and quantum computing cooperation. We've already allocated budgets to work in international partnerships for AI and quantum computing cooperation, and we should be fully on board in those areas and contribute the resources and our excellent institutions and experts to add value both to the Quad and AUKUS in those particular areas.
Thank you, Professor. Recently, we heard from our top generals in the Canadian military, and I think that they have a very different opinion, of course, than you in terms of the need to align ourselves in terms of defense equipment and procurement with our allies. They seem to have a different opinion in terms of protecting our Canadian sovereignty, and I could go on, but just our defense experts in this country don't seem to be aligned quite with where you're at on this. So would you suggest then that we should be putting our time rather in the UN, for example? That's where we should be putting a little bit more of our time, from your opinion?
I think the UN is a compromised institution. I think, again, we should be working with like-minded countries, and I don't think we need to solely focus on the defense area of cooperation. We can work in enlarging the comprehensive progressive trans-Pacific partnership so we can shape the rules of the region that will potentially shape Chinese behavior. We can talk about digital cooperation. We can talk about AI and quantum computing cooperation. Defense is important, but there's many other partners within the region that can help us engage with the Indo-Pacific and also China, and it doesn't necessarily need to revolve strictly around defense.
Understood. I do, though, have some concerns for your position, though, in the sense that the United States is the only power in the world that can really rival anything that China has. I don't think you would disagree with that. So the idea that we would move away from aligning ourselves with our oldest and strongest ally and sort of avoid international agreements with our allies that include the U.S., like AUKUS and the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, I feel that that's a bit reckless. That the farther away we are from the U.S., the more we may open ourselves up to being heard. And I take your point fully regarding the two Michaels, though I think that may be more of a case of the leaders of the President of the United States and our Prime Minister not having a strong enough relationship. I think that there's something to be said there. That being said, I do have concerns with your position. And I'll just conclude, Mr. Chair. And again, you had said earlier that we need to align with the UN, the IMF a little bit more, and the World Health Organization. But as pointed out by Mr. Neve, the UN Human Rights Council voted against condemning the Uyghur genocide in China. So I do have concerns with the priorities that you've outlined today, but I do very much appreciate your perspective. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Dancho. We will now go to Mr. Cormier for 5 minutes or less.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Écoutez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My questions are for Mr. Nagy mostly. Mr. Neve, you both have experience in terms of our trade relationships. We've heard from a number of witnesses who have had a variety of opinions on our trade relationship with China. Do you believe Canada can really do without China when it comes to trade, when it comes to what we import from China and even our exports towards China? Mr. Neve, if you want to start, and then Mr. Nagy, just to hear what you have to say about that in terms of trading relationship and what we do with China without having a direct impact on Canada's economy and our businesses.
The question of what the nature of our business dealings and trading relationship with China should be, again, from my perspective, has to much more seriously take human rights on board. For 20 years in my previous role as Secretary General of Amnesty International, I can't count the number of times that I and other civil society leaders were putting in front of governments from both parties a set of recommendations as to how human rights considerations need to be much more directly brought into shaping the nature and extent of our business relationship, not ending it, not even necessarily limiting it, but very deliberately bringing human rights into its core. Human rights impact assessments, for instance, human rights considerations shaping the nature of trade missions and so much more. And we really haven't seen that. And I think that's where we need to start in terms of really grappling with the nature of our business dealings.
Merci, Monsieur Nagy.
Mr. Nagy?
So I agree fully with Mr. Neve that human rights should be a critical part of how we engage in our trading relationships, including our trading relationship with China. However, I do think that we need to think broadly in terms of the broader region and the partners that we need to build within the region. And if we have human rights as the Canadian-style human rights as the litmus test for economic engagement within the region, we will cut off critical partners that are going to be essential for building a resilient relationship with China and a relationship within the broader Indo-Pacific region that will pull China in a more positive direction over time. We should continue to trade, but we should ensure that, again, when we can at all possible junctures, put human rights at the center of that relationship. But again, thinking about shaping behavior over the long term, we need to build partnerships, and then we need to be sensitive to the different and the heterogeneous nature of governments and their human rights approaches within the region.
Parfait, merci. Et je pense qu'on est...
Perfect, thank you. We all agree that human rights have to be central to all of this. It's, however, easy to do certain things and very difficult to change sometimes the ways we've done things. To turn to other trading partners is also a challenge. But as you know, the strategies we're looking at will help with this. And in continuing in this vein, I understand your point of view, but at the end of the day, there's going to be a major impact on the economy for our country and other countries. If I looked at recently, I looked at a report that was saying Taiwan produces 60% of semiconductors and microchips, and it would be devastating for a number of countries throughout the world if China invaded, for instance, Taiwan. So what do we do to get back on our feet and find other options? Don't seem to be that many other options when I look at what's going on when it comes to semiconductors and microchips. It looks as though Taiwan is one of the only countries that can provide these tools. What do we do to secure our companies and our economy in this respect?
Again, a brief answer, please, sir.
So, Mr. Cormier, you're very right. The hundreds of thousands of jobs that Canadians enjoy in automobile industries are directly related to the semiconductor chips that are based in Taiwan and built by Taiwan. It will be moving forward. It'll be critical that Canada works with Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the United States, and perhaps Germany and other countries with these capabilities to selectively diversify some of these supply chains to like-minded countries and more safe countries, quite frankly. But that shouldn't mean that we don't engage in trade in other areas with China. And I think the key term here is selective diversification away from China in supply chains that are critical, such as semiconductors and pharmaceuticals, as two primary examples.
Thank you, Mr. Nagy. We'll now go to Mr. Bergeron for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Minister Joly said that Canada's development strategy for the Indo-Pacific region will aim to support the moves of other countries that have the same vision as we do, including Japan's vision. Mr. Nagy, in your view, why would the minister specifically point out that the Indo-Pacific policy for Canada would include Japan?
So Mademoiselle Joly was here in Tokyo 2 weeks ago. We hosted her here at the Canadian Embassy, and we had an excellent discussion. The Canadians and the Japanese put forward a 6-point action plan in terms of their cooperation within the region. It focused on environmental cooperation. It focused on strengthening maritime domain awareness, focused on supporting a rules-based structure, and it focused on non-traditional security areas. Japan is the most influential country within the region outside Japan. It is an excellent partner in terms of taking on a nuanced approach to how it engages with the Chinese relationship. But at the same time, it's been a champion of building alternative partnerships within the region to, again, build a critical mass of countries that will pull China in a different direction. They're doing this through infrastructure connectivity, through development policies, through building resilience into supply chains. And I think that these are potentially areas that Canada can cooperate directly with Japan and other like-minded countries, again, to build resilience in the relationship and pull China in a more positive direction over time. And I think that this is the critical aspect that we're thinking about. How can we pull China in a more positive direction over time with like-minded countries like Japan?
Thank you very much. Like Mr. Chung, and following Mr. Chung's questions to Mr. Hamilton, I have one more question, Mr. Chair. What were the outcomes of the actions taken by Australia to try to react to China's influence on its policy? What were the outcomes for Australia? The implementation of all these measures by that country. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bergeron. And now for our final 2.5 minutes to you, Ms. McPherson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Neva, I'm just going to ask you a couple more questions, I think, on the human rights situation with regards to China. One of my concerns that I have is that as the Chinese government looks inward, as we have sort of a chilling of the relationship, or I guess a continued chilling of the relationship, I'm quite worried that it will impact our ability to actually respond to those unlawfully detained Canadians that we see in China. How do we manage that? How do we help deal with the fact that, of course, we want to see Hussein Jalil and reunited with his family, but as we strengthen our approach to China, does that make it less likely that we can have success with that?
And I think you're highlighting a very troubling tension, which I think has been a reality for quite a number of years, and if anything is only deepening. And I think it's one of the reasons why a number of civil society groups and certainly Mr. Jalil's family have put a variety of proposals for something like a special expert, a special envoy, a special representative. Now, in that instance, it's been someone who would have a very dedicated role of advocating on his behalf. And this doesn't mean doing so in a very public way. In fact, I think people would imagine that this would be someone who works very quiet diplomatic channels, has relationships they can build on, maybe through other kinds of dealings, the business world, etc. I'd expand that out to the fact that Mr. Jalil's case is perhaps the most wrenching and compelling right now. But we could quickly compile a long list of all of the Canadian citizens and permanent residents over the last 20 years who have found themselves unjustly detained. And these challenges around how to get access, who to talk to, have always been there. So I think we really need some dedicated expertise to work that file.
Well, and I would think, too, the protection of those people within China, within Hong Kong, within some of the regions that are the human rights defenders, that want to continue to be doing their work as China looks inward, obviously must be at great risk. And how we preventatively, how we act preventatively to ensure that those groups, those individuals that are working on human rights, working on open democracy, pro-democracy movements, are not being persecuted or are given as much protection as we can give them.
Oh, that couldn't be more important. I think, going back to one of my other recommendations about the need for a whole of government human rights strategy for Canada, that very point about really lifting up the role, the work done by frontline human rights defenders right across the country. And there are many of them. They are incredibly vulnerable, and even in the face of crackdowns, continue with their work. But ensuring that we're doing everything we can to protect that space should be central to that strategy.
Thank you very much. That brings to a conclusion a fascinating panel, and we thank you very much, Mr. Neve and Mr. Nagy. Mr. Hamilton, I'm told that we do have your speaking notes, and they are off to translation and will be in the hands of our members by tomorrow afternoon. As you can, we would appreciate you transmitting the answers to the questions that were posed to you. The clerk says she would bake you a cake or something if you could get them to her tomorrow. But certainly early the next day as well would be fine, because we have two very good analysts here who are going to try and put together all of the details that we've heard over the last couple of meetings. So again,
what can I do to get a cake?
Thank you very much. We will now. Yes, Mr. Chong.
Could I also ask you, Mr. Chair, to ensure that the questions, that the answers in response to the questions I posed are distributed to all members of the committee when they become available to you?
And translated as well. Absolutely. Thank you again. We will now take a break. We're going to go into some committee business.
No, you're not done.
Thank you.